Okay, in this video, we're continuing our discussion of ARC Section 90A, or the review of financial statements. And in the last several videos, we've been discussing the Accountant's Review Report and the general inclusions that we need to include in it, as well as any modifications we need to make for various circumstances. And so for this particular video, we will be discussing the modifications to the Accountant's Review Report we need to make, and we need to alert the users of the financial statements that the Accountant's Review Report is restricted. So it says here that our review report should include an alert in a separate paragraph that restricts its use when the subject matter of the report is based on these two things. So the first one is that the measurement or disclosure criteria that are determined by the accountant to be suitable only for a limited number of users who can be presumed to have an adequate understanding of the criteria, or measurement or disclosure criteria that are available only to the specified parties. And so we'll get to what this means in a little bit in this explanatory section here, but let's continue on in the section. It says that the alert in this separate paragraph that restricts the use of the Accountant's Review Report should include a few items, and that be that it states that the Accountant's Review Report is intended solely for the information and use of the specified parties, and we need to identify the specified parties for whom it's intended. And it should also state that the review report is not intended to be and should not be used by anyone other than the specified parties. And so if we have prepared that paragraph with these items and that restricts the use of the review report to certain specified parties, and then we find out later we need to add other parties as specified parties, we should determine whether to agree to add the parties as specified parties. So we can't just take it at face value and add those parties to the review report. We need to determine whether we agree that they should be added. And so if we add those parties after we've already released the Accountant's Review Report, we should do one of two things. We should either amend the Accountant's Review Report to add the other parties and not change the original date of the Accountant's Review Report, or we should provide a written acknowledgement to management and other parties that such parties have been added as specified parties, and then state in the acknowledgement that no procedures were performed subsequent to the original date of the Accountant's Review Report. So we can either reissue our review report, or we can just write a letter to management letting them know that we added another party to the report. So we have a lot of explanatory material here to make it more clear to us how and when we should add specified parties to the report. So let's go down to these sections, to A110 through A114. Okay, so now we're down to the explanatory material as it relates to adding a restriction to the Accountant's Review Report. It says here that the need for an alert that restricts the review report arises from the potential for the review report to be misunderstood if taken out of context in which the review report was intended to be used. So it says here if we're using a general purpose framework, for instance, GAAP, we usually don't need to add a restriction because the intended users of this report are diverse and varied, and so it's not like users would take that out of context. However, nothing in SARS precludes us from including an alert in our review report. So, for example, if we prepared, or the financial statements were prepared specifically for the use in acquisition, and even though they prepared them under a general purpose framework like GAAP, we could still include a restriction in there to say that the review report is restricted to the people for which the financial statements are prepared for in acquisition. And so next, we see here that it's impossible for us to control the distribution of the Accountant's Review Report after it's released. And that's why we include this paragraph that discusses the restriction on the review report, so that if the report falls into the hands of someone for which it was unintended for, then that person will not misunderstand how the report should be used. And so in that respect, we might also consider informing the entity or the specified parties that the review report is not intended for distribution to parties other than those specified in the Accountant's Review Report. That way it doesn't fall into the wrong hands. And we might could include that in our engagement letter, or consider it in our client acceptance and continuous policies or discussions as well. And next we have an illustration of how the paragraph can go in our review report. And it uses the elements that we saw in the requirement 62 above. And so the example says this report is intended solely for the information and use of the specified parties, and is not intended to be and should not be used by anyone other than these specified parties. So fairly simple, but it includes all the elements that we're supposed to include. And so finally, we remember in the requirements at .63, if we're adding another specified party to the report, we need to consider whether it's appropriate to add that specified party. And we can do this by considering factors such as the identity of the other party and the intended use of the Accountant's Review Report. So make sure that those two things match.